periodically.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone to the Gospels vet program, which is, we've got 4 sessions. This is session 1, and we're looking at the context of the Gospels, context of Jesus for week 1. But before we get underway, we might begin with a prayer. Loving God, thanks for this opportunity to look at your word and to discover some important things about the first 4 books as recorded in the New Testament. And we pray that you might make yourself known to us as we discover things during this time together. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I thought I might begin by introducing myself a bit. For posterity, in the outline, you'll find a little bit about me on page 5 of the Gospel outline that you would have received. There it is. And on page 5 there, but that was also written last year, just a little bit of update. I have an extra grandchild, an Australian one. Fantastic. Since I wrote this, and my daughter in Engadine and her husband have a little baby girl that's now 2.5 months old. And her name is Zippy. Zippy, so that's really good. Oh, that's what I call her anyway. Sephora is her proper name. And yeah, so that's all very good. I'm currently doing some lecturing at Flinders University in transition studies. That's I'm helping students who don't have a degree to get into degree programs. So it may be that they're bombed out at high school or mature age entry. So I've got students in my classes that range from just leaving school, 18 years old, up until 65 or something. So anyway, that's all good, and I'm excited about all of that, and also about doing this vet course in the Gospels, which is really good. Okay, as I said earlier, there's 4 sessions. Today's the first of 4, where we're looking at the context of Jesus, the context of the Gospels. This will give us a bit of an introduction as to what we're going to cover today. That will look at what the course entails. We'll do a little bit of an icebreaker. Look at the CV of Jesus, the religious political sects of the first century, a brief history of Israel from Abraham to Jesus. Look at the first assignment that's due in a fortnight today, and why is the context important, and there are some references. Just before we do that, there is one textbook for the course, and this is a Fee and Stewart, How to Read the Bible, book by book. It's an excellent resource. It's not something you're going to buy and forget about it, leave it on your shelf once you get it home, but it's a good resource, and it's not just for Gospels, it's for any other studies you do, biblical studies. So really excellent, very good summaries of each book in the Bible, and a very useful preface and introduction. So I recommend that for you to get. There are copies or at least one copy in the library. Also, there's another one by Fee and Stewart, which is another good read and a very useful book, which you'll find very helpful with your exegesis, and that is How to Read the Bible, read the Bible for all it's worth. Mine is the second edition, and I think they're up to the 5th edition now. So this was 1993 when we got this, but it was a textbook that I used when I lectured Introduction to Exegesis, and it's still a very useful book, especially the updated version. Having gone through those, let's have a look at the introduction, the icebreaker. Now, before we do that, a bit of an intro to this, the Gospels course. Next time we meet won't be next Tuesday, it'll be the week after. Oh, there's some copies of the books I've just been talking about there. Thank you, Jessie. Next time we meet will be the 29th of August, and we're looking at comparing the 4 Gospels, and there will be an assignment to do that, and I'll be talking about assignments just in a little bit. The third session on the 5th of September, we'll be looking at the distinctiveness of the 4 Gospels, and then on the 12th of the 9th, our final week, we'll I'll tell you what, I didn't write down the topic of that, but that'll become clearer as we progress on. If you have access to your outline, that's the this document here. If you turn to page 7, you'll find the details of the assessments that are part of this course. There's 4 reasonably small assignments. They're not huge by any stretch in terms of word length, but because this is a competency-based course, you'll need to pass each step along the way. So you'll only get a satisfactory or unsatisfactory, and if you listen to what we're talking about in class and look at the resources that are there for you in the resource list on ACD Online, then I'm sure you'll find everything you'll need to find. So the first assessment is to complete a worksheet of 4 parts outlining the major geographical, historical, social, political and religious aspects of the times from which the Gospels came. So that's on page 7, the first assessment task. The second one is looking at the similarities and distinctiveness of the 4 Gospels, and there's 2 parts to that. You compare the 4 accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, one in each of the Gospels. And the second part is to complete a worksheet describing author, date, key themes, similarities and distinctives of the 4 Gospels. So it's a little bit of an extension of the first thing. Now, I don't want you to write a 1,000-word exegesis of the comparison of the feeding of the 5,000. 1 page maximum would be adequate. So that would be ideal. That's about 250, 300 words, thereabouts. And the worksheet describing author, date, key themes, similarities and distinctiveness of the 4 Gospels, that will be helpful as well. The third assignment, now the first 2 we're probably going to do in class and discussion amongst ourselves. The third one is one that you do separately, in your own time, and that is to draw a timeline that identifies the key events in the life of Jesus. And second part of that is to identify and describe 3 key teachings of Jesus. Now for that you probably only need to do about 5, between 4 and 8 sentences on each. So it doesn't need to be long, just a paragraph on each of the 3 teachings of Jesus, okay? So it might be, for instance, Kingdom of God. What does Jesus mean by that when he used that term? Might be Son of Man. What did Jesus, what was the, who, first of all, who uses that term? What is it about? What does it mean? And how many times is it found in the New Testament? Those sort of, simple things that you might find in a concordance or a Bible dictionary. Then the final assignment is to post a forum piece on a key gospel theme. So in other words, you might want to pick one of the themes that you've done for assignment 3 and do a bit more, write about a page on it, and then post it on the forum for the gospel module, and you'll need to comment on each other's submission, and it will be like a peer assessment. So you're commenting on what each other have written, and you'll need to exegete and interpret a chosen passage with that particular theme in that for that assignment. So, are there any questions about the assignments? Some things may not be all that clear, but maybe they'll come clearer as we press on. Okay. Oh, by the way, my email address is kevin.sarlo@flinders.edu.au, and if you need to contact me, please do so. Kevin.sarlo, or you're going to put that up on the board? Thank you, Jesse. Also, as part of your this course, there is a resource list. Now, I'm sure this is probably in your outline, but I don't have a page number for that. And there are a list of 14 resources that you'll find very helpful for your understanding and also doing of your assessment work.
Correct.
Yep, that's it. So all your correspondence can come to me through that email address. All of these resources are separately available for download at ACD Online. So if you click on resources, then all of these will come up, and we'll be using some of them next week in a fortnight's time for session number 2 as well. Also, there is in the outline suggestion for you to use a study Bible. Now you can choose whichever one you like to use, whether it's a New Revised Standard Version, a New Jerusalem Bible, a Revised English Bible, or a New International Version. Again, it's one of whatever you prefer. There is a little bit of difference in terms of which particular one you might want to use. The New Revised Standard Version is probably the more scholarly and literal translation of the text. The New Jerusalem Bible is initially it was a Catholic edition of the scriptures. A little bit of I'll talk about that when I talk about the NIV, but the Revised English Bible is more along the lines of the New Revised Standard Version, but a little bit less scholarly. In other words, the vocab is tighter, in other words, a little bit more easily to understand than the New Revised Standard Version, which has a bigger vocab, but still very scholarly and very readable. The NIV and the New Jerusalem Bible are what's called dynamic equivalents. Now, if we sort of have on one side the literal translation of a word-for-word translation, and then on the other side we might have a paraphrase, which is where the translator, understanding the Greek, puts it in the thought patterns of today. Right, so it's not really a translating word for word, but a translating of thought patterns. So that's sort of if we see a literal translation and a paraphrase, they're two end swings of the pendulum, if you like. And so often the paraphrase, if you're doing a Bible study, it's not really helpful because you really want to know what the original literal words were meaning. And often it's good for a devotional, but not so much for a Bible study. So we're tending towards the literal when we come to do Bible studies. And when we come to the NIV and the Revised English Bible, the REB, what we're finding there is more what's called the dynamic equivalence. In other words, it's down towards the bottom of the pendulum, and it takes into consideration the literal meaning, but also sometimes uses a bit of paraphrase to give understanding to the text.
Sorry, Kevin,
yeah,
just
sure.
to put some names on those for the students. Would something, do you think, like the NLT or the Good News Bible or the Message be too far?
Yeah, they're more towards a paraphrase, okay? And that's why we discourage biblical scholarship reference to those. They're more for devotional rather than actual study of the scriptures, okay?
Yeah.
So when it's time for you to purchase, a study Bible, it's probably best to pick one that's either dynamic equivalence or literal, rather than towards the paraphrase end.
Yeah.
It's okay to have the others as a reference tool and as to give you some idea of the gist of what the passage is about if you've got no idea, but when it's all said and done, it's the literal meaning of the text that we really want to find out when we're doing Bible study.
That's great, that's helpful, thank you. We've got an NRSV that lives up the back as well, if anyone ever needs to borrow
Sure.
an NRSV.
Yeah, good. Also, when it comes to referencing, when you hand in some work, especially if you are doing second and the third and fourth assignments, you'll especially need, or even when you're doing the second assignment too, you're going to need to show me where you found the material that you're using. And there are specific ways for you to do that, and the VET program requires you to follow the Chicago style of referencing. And you'll find an example of that. Where are we? Where is it? On page 14 of your outline, where it's made reference to Fee and Stewart's book, How to Read the Bible Book by Book. You'll find there author's name, time end of bracket, and the year of publication. So you'll need to do that. That's like your bibliographical, your reference at the end of your assignment. And if you're using your footnotes, you'll need to give the author's name and the title and the page number. Okay? Author's name, title and page number. Any questions about referencing? Some of you may be familiar with those, that type of detail.
Yeah, we'll have a referencing guide, a website link up.
There is one that's referenced, that's given to you, I think, on the previous page.
On the ACD webpage.
On the ACD webpage, yeah. Yeah. And I think you'll find it may be useful for you also when you're doing some reading apart from the resources, or even if you are doing reading from the resources, for you to keep a journal. In other words, keep a record of what you're doing to read and to understand more for this particular topic. So keep a check on yourself for what you'll need to use, or what you do with your research time. So make so detail what you are doing week by week, so you can then refer back to it. Sometimes it's helpful for us in terms of assessment. If we're not sure of how you're going with the course, if you can show us where or what you've read, and that sort of thing, and that will keep us up to date and you up to date of where you are in the course. Okay. If you have a look at page what page are we up to? Okay, if we have a look at this next one here now. So, as a bit of an icebreaker, we're going to have a look at the life of Jesus, and also look at our own lives. Jesus was a Jewish male who lived at a particular time and particular place. The time was the 1st century in the Christian era, and the place was Palestine. And there were 3 key points: the fact that Jesus was a Jew, that he lived in Palestine, and he lived in the 1st century are all important. This is so that we can understand the story of Jesus and the impact that he had on people's lives. And it's very important that we understand these things to understand something about the world that Jesus lived in. So what I'm going to do is for each of us to share a little bit about ourselves, and we put ourselves in the context of doing gospel study. Just like we're going to find out about Jesus. So I'll start off, tell you a little bit about myself with these guidelines. My name's Kevin Sarlo. Now, I think that I'm the only Sarlo male with my spelling, S-A-R-L-O-W, in Australia.
Really? With that surname?
Yeah,
Fascinating.
it is fascinating. There are people that probably have the same pronunciation, S-O-L-O, S-A-L-A-U, different other spellings, but only with that particular spelling of Sarlo. The reason being is that my father's father was an only son. My dad was an only son. I'm an only son. I have one son, and he's only got one son, with not much likelihood of there being any more. So our family tree depends on my son's son, Caleb Sarlo, and he doesn't live in Australia. So that could be the end of our family tree. Never mind. My country of origin is Australia, of course. I was born and bred in Newcastle, New South Wales, and we can trace back on my mother's family tree to some convict heritage. So I've got some convict blood, which is pretty fashionable if you live in New South Wales, but not so much over here, because it was settled by free settlers. Okay. Again, Australia is a very lucky country, place of peace, place of opportunities. You know, if I'd have been born in some countries in the world, I could not have achieved what I have by being born in Australia. I'm well educated, but those opportunities are not necessarily the case for those who are born elsewhere. What do I enjoy? I enjoy good coffee. I enjoy family time. I enjoy playing the guitar. You see, I'm a double certificate barista, but I don't think I'll ever get a job in a cafe because I'm too slow. But what it's done is that it's stuffed me up drinking coffee everywhere. I only like to make it my own, or some tried and tested places that I've proven that they make good coffee. So, also I'm enjoying watching TV series that we've purchased on DVD that we watch through the episodes with my wife and sometimes mother-in-law who's living with us. What do I value? Well, I value Christian life. I value family time, and I value my marriage of nearly 41 years. I value my call to ministry, and I value the time I can spend sharing my experience and my understanding of what it means to love Jesus. I was ordained in 1982 in Uniting Church, and served in 6 parishes full time in New South Wales and South Australia for 30 years of ministry. What have I achieved? Well, I'm a licensed electrician, 11 years in the electrical trade. God's calling to ministry, Diploma of Theology, Bachelor of Theology, Master of Theology, and PhD. Now that PhD was been a passion, I suppose, for 25 years to do, and completed it after 3.5 years. At Flinders University in October last year, and graduated in April this year. My skills really are in teaching and encouraging, mentoring and maximising. Now, maximising is taking what others have done and building on that to make something better. And what do I plan to achieve? Well, I'm heading over to Boston in November to see if I can get my PhD published. I've enrolled at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, and my PhD thesis is in the stability of irony in the fourth gospel passion narrative. So that's a little bit about myself. I probably spent too long, but perhaps Robert, if you want to tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, my name's Robert Cartridge. I was born in South Australia, in Clarendon. Parents, mother's side can be traced back to coming on the buffalo. Father was a 10-pound pom who came here when he was 11. What else? Education. Went to Irvine Agricultural High School. From there, was in the military for 4 years. Got out, went back to school, got a Certificate 3 in mining exploration. Then did some more study and ended up working my way through to a Cert 4 in aircraft engineering. What do I enjoy to do with my time? I like working on old motorcycles and working with my hands and doing leather work and making knives. What do I value? I value my family and spending time with my sister and her 2 girls. What have I achieved? A Dux in aircraft engineering mechanical. Youth Recognition Award for my service in the CFS. What do I plan on achieving? Growing my faith further and growing in this call to in Christian studies.
Fantastic.
And a Cert 4 in Christian life and ministry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll probably go Mike, and then we can sort of have questions if you like. Okay, Mike.
My name's Mike Wardrop. I'm also Australian, born and raised in South Australia, but I'm an adopted child of the early 80s. So my parents were both young. I was going to say this, so I came from, anyway, doesn't matter. They were young, and so I was born and raised in SA, so I've got my adoptive family, and then I've got 2 halves of a biological family, and I know them all at this point, so my family's quite complicated in a very nice way. I'm not a dual citizen, so I'm eligible to be a member of parliament in this country, unlike very few other people. So, of course, all the things that were true for Kevin and Robert are true for me in terms of opportunities, but I also had more opportunities because I was raised as an only child. So I was raised by 2 teachers, but because I was an only child, they put me through Pembroke, which is an expensive and high-quality school, and if I'd had a brother or sister, that wouldn't have been the case. They wouldn't have been able to afford to do that. So an opportunity was afforded to me because of my family size, and not just because of my class or anything like that. We weren't so much wealthy as there was just less people to share it around. What do I enjoy and like to do with my time? I love to watch movies, particularly old movies, classics, and one of my bucket list goals is to watch every Academy Award Best Picture nominee ever. Not the winners, the nominees.
Oh, wow.
It's a long goal.
It is a long goal.
It's a long goal. I
Yeah.
probably get through about 30 a year, and they add about 9 more every year, so I'm not really making that much headway, but we'll get there. I love to spend time with my kids, who are lots of fun, and my wife, and I like to what else to do? I like to play and watch sports of most kinds, really. What do I value? I also value my marriage greatly, of almost 11 years. I value my children and who they are and who they're becoming. I value the freedom I have to be who I am and express who I want, express what I need to express in Australia, which I think is a very special thing. I value deeply my faith and my relationship with Jesus, and my calling into ministry. Yeah, let's leave that. And what have I achieved? Oh, we might need a plug for your computer.
Okay.
No, just a mouse.
Oh, it's doing an update. That'll be right.
Oh. What have I achieved? I degree in the International Baccalaureate, did reasonably well there. Bachelor of Commerce and a Graduate Diploma of Market Research. A recent degree as a Bachelor of Ministry, graduated with Kevin actually. And I'm sure I've got various bits and pieces along the way from different things, but those are probably the main sort of certificate-y ones. And spent some time along the way in various roles in sales and chaplaincy and what else did I do? Recruiting, and eventually found my way into youth pastoring and then ministry, and was ordained as a minister in 2016. So about a year ago today. So I've been what's that? What was the previous category? Achievements. Yeah, achieved that too, I guess. And what do I look forward to? Well, we're in the midst of planning a church at the moment, which my wife and I are heading up. So that's very exciting, and I love doing that, and I look forward to when it's up and running.
Oh, good. Excellent.
And I can't recall the final category. What's the final category?
Let's have a look. What do you plan to achieve?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
That'll do. And no more kids, probably.
Skills?
Oh, skills. I'm a pretty good speaker. Just
Okay.
I think I'm okay at preaching, but most ministers think they're good preachers. but I'm quite a good public speaker generally, and quite good at bringing people together through networking and connection, but also in, I guess, the 2 Corinthians ministry of reconciliation that we looked at this morning as well, both with people, but I think with Jesus as well. There's a bit of the evangelist in it.
Okay.
I think I'm a pretty decent friend most of the time. Competent husband.
Good.
It's probably as far as I'd go.
Have we got any questions that we want to ask each other?
Oh, I'll share your... Everything you said about coffee is also true for me, except for the certificates. Yeah. I was warned off that by the owner of Coffee by the Beans. He said,
Okay.
No, don't worry about it. But
No.
everything else is true for me. So.
Yeah, good. No, we've got even our own little cafe area at home.
Oh, do you really?
With a commercial machine. And,
Oh, what machine do you have?
Oh, it's a. We used to have an expo bar, and this one is a. I can't even tell you now. But the expo bar died, and so we and got another one. What's this one?
Is your wife a
No,
coffee
no.
snob as well?
Oh, she's 14 certificate, the barista trainer.
Oh, wow. She's a trainer.
Mm.
Right, okay. Okay.
We're talking Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, Adelaide.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Not just Adelaide, Roseworthy. So, yeah, so, you know, she got a certificate for at Roseworthy, but it was basically to do with baristering. Yeah, so she's done barista certificates in 4 capitals in Australia. Yeah, so I've only done Sydney, Adelaide, so
That's pretty good.
Blue Wave and Lavazza. Yeah. Hutt Street,
Different
yeah.
brand.
Yeah.
Yes.
So each particular coffee roastery does, or most coffee roasteries do their own training.
Yeah, I know Patio
Yeah,
does
yeah.
as well.
Yeah, so that just gives you a little bit of a clue on that.
Yeah. You got a favourite coffee shop, Bella?
Well,
Just give us one, otherwise it'll get too long.
I like the Barrow in the Lane at Flinders University. That's the only one that I'm drinking at the moment.
Yeah.
Because I'm now discovered I'm lactose intolerant, so
Oh no.
which stuffs a lot of places up. They don't carry lactose-free milk, so. But these guys do at no extra charge, so
Oh, that's good.
that is good. As well as that, he's an excellent barista. He knows what he's doing, and he comes from Mount Barker. So what else can I say? Robert, you said that you have got some military background. Want to enlighten us a little bit on?
Yep. So after high school, joined the army as in the cavalry. So I drove armoured vehicles for 4 years up in Darwin.
Wow. Okay.
Got to visit a bit of the world as well. Got to drive a quad bike out of the back of a Chinook. Parasail off the Holiday Inn in Darwin. Sleep in the jungle in Malaysia.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Good.
So we've got the whole week.
Sounds exciting.
It was good fun.
Yeah. And question for you, Robert. Tell us a bit about Pembroke. What was that experience?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Mike. Yeah.
What's Pembroke like? I mean, it's a bit snooty, as you'd expect from a school like that, but it's not too bad. I mean, I certainly didn't think too many of my fellow students were, had a sort of were up to themselves or anything like that. And I came from a public primary school, so I was used to a very different style of education. No, it's good. They're very music and academic focused. Sadly, not really good at sports. They've got this sort of Hall of Fame like most schools do with their sports stars. There's not many really famous ones. Tom Moody is probably the most famous. And the Inverarities, John Inverarity.
Oh, okay.
And then
Cricketers. Yeah.
well, and then Alison Inverarity, who was an athlete as well.
Oh, okay.
His daughter. And so most recently, Angus Momfries and I went to school together.
Okay.
He was a few years younger than me.
He's a footballer, isn't he? Yeah. Yeah.
Plays for the Power. Yeah.
Oh, this is, I mean, I've come from the New South Wales, so
Oh, of course.
I'm not all that familiar with
Different code.
with Australian rules footy, but no,
Yeah.
good rugby league and soccer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Another bit of soccer.
in my earlier years played for about 10 seasons, coached for a few more, and then was a senior referee, and even refereed Super League in the
Really?
Riverina, Churches Comp in Sydney, because that was on a Saturday while I was preaching on Sundays, so
Yeah.
that was all helpful. Yeah. No, a bit of that. I loved a bit of cricket. I played a bit of cricket in my first parish in Berrigan, down the bottom of the Riverina, and was a opening batsman. But, didn't progress too much.
Patient. You've got to be very patient to be an
Very
opener.
patient. Well,
Too
that's
much
what
of a
I was.
filthy slogger. I can't do
Yeah,
it.
nah.
Don't have the temperament.
And I think my temperament suited open, so anyway, that was good. So let's have a look at, unfortunately, I don't know if I can get into Control, Alt, Delete. Let's see if I can get into this one. Oh, goodness. No.
Everything okay?
Oh, I just can't log into this computer, and the other mine has only got a HDMI output, so
Oh, is it still
I
recording?
can't get.
Do
So,
you want to borrow mine?
well, might help.
Yeah.
Can't get into this one. It's not recognising my password, I don't think.
That's fine. Let's do that then.
Is it? Is it welcome? No, it doesn't recognise me at all. So kind of
Frustrating.
it is.
It's the,
It did an update and that stuffed everything. So I rebooted.
Okay.
There we go.
There we are.
We'll need to turn that off.
There are advantages of having a horrible old laptop.
Yeah. Now we might need to. That's the one. Now it's the last engagement.
Okay,
gospel,
I'll
yeah,
let you
yeah.
take a break.
So, thank you for that,
You're
Mike.
very welcome. Lovely.
Does that come up? There we go. Look at that.
Beautiful.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So, Jesus CV. Firstborn of Joseph and Mary of Nazareth. His origin was pre-existence, as we find in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in verse 14 of John 1, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, that of the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. So, the Word, Christ became flesh and dwelt among us. So we got an understanding there that his origin was before creation. Gender was male. Approximate date of birth. Interesting. He was born during the time of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC. So probably the latest date for the birth of Jesus is 4 BC. Maybe the earliest would be about 6 BC. So we've got a bit of a flexible thing there happening. The approximate date of death and resurrection was 30 in the Christian era. It might have even been earlier than that. You know, if he was born in 6 BC, it could have been 26 AD or thereabouts, 25 to 30 CE, the Christian era. His parents were both Jewish. In other words, Paul says in Philippians 3 that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, but so was Jesus. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. And Jesus' tribe was from the tribe of Judah. If we have a look at the 12 sons of Jacob, they were pretty much the 12 tribes of Israel, and both Joseph and Mary can trace their lineage back to Judah. If you want to follow the lineage of Matthew's Gospel, I think it's from memory, Matthew chapter 3. It's probably Joseph's lineage, and the lineage of Mary is probably Luke's version. And both of them go back to Judah. His home address, even though he was born in Bethlehem of Judea, his home address was Nazareth in Galilee. And that was where Joseph and Mary lived. Joseph the carpenter, and that was probably the training that Jesus got in his youth, was that of the trade of a carpenter or house builder. And obviously in his later years, his occupation was an itinerant preacher. How many languages do you think Jesus spoke? And what were they? Any ideas?
Greek.
Greek, yeah.
Latin because of the Romans.
Yeah, yeah. What was the language of the Old Testament?
Hebrew.
Yeah. And what was Jesus' mother tongue?
Aramaic.
That's it.
Oh, okay.
Woo! Well done. There we go.
You beat me. I had all four, but I forgot that Latin was the actual language of Roman. I was just going to say.
That's right. Yeah. So Aramaic was his mother tongue, a language that he spoke at home. Hebrew was the language of the Old Testament, which he was well versed in. In fact, for a Jewish boy's bar mitzvah, the age of 12, he would have had to learn and recite a whole chapter in Hebrew. Probably from Torah. In other words, they're not short chapters. 50 or 60 verses in Hebrew. Okay. So that was the schooling to not just learn the Hebrew, but to also to begin to argue with the elders and the learned people from the synagogue. And so we could say that by the time of his ministry, the beginning and the call of his disciples, his understanding and knowledge of the scriptures was excellent. and debating and orating skill also was excellent. So there's a little bit of the CV of Jesus. Very handy to get all of this in sort of one little nutshell as a background for us to understand the Gospels. Okay, we might pause for a break, I think, and if we can come back in about a quarter of an hour or so, because we'll be pressing on for another couple of hours. So if we can come back about 3:15, that'd be great. Okay, we're back on. Welcome back. We're going to be looking at some basic groups of people around the time of Jesus. And this is part of your homework, that you'll need to write a couple of sentences on each one of these. Okay, so let's have a look. Pharisees are mentioned in each of the Gospels. They were not professionals at all. They were lay people. And part of what the Pharisees' understanding was that all of the scriptures, all of what we consider the Old Testament, as well as a lot of the other apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings of the Old Testament, were considered to them as part of God's revelation. So they accepted the whole idea of the scriptural writing as revelation from God. And because of that, they affirmed the biblical understanding of resurrection, which is basically only found scantily in the Old Testament, more predictably in Daniel's visions. I think in Daniel 12, 1-3. The future judgment, eschatology, in other words, the teaching of the end times. Messianic expectation. In other words, there were instances in the Old Testament of speaking of a messianic figure, but each of those were couched in the language of the time and could also be interpreted as a messianic prophecy later on. But mostly the expectation that God was going to send a Messiah figure was a much later phenomenon for the people of Israel. Even more so when the expectation that the person who was in power at the time wasn't fitting the bill in terms of what they expected someone living a godly life to do. For instance, for a king in Israel, they were seen as a Messiah, because the word Messiah means anointed one. And therefore, the kings were seen as Messiahs because they were anointed at their enthronement when they became king. They were people who, the Pharisees were people who loved the law. In other words, they just didn't recognise the Ten Commandments that were given through Moses. But rather what they did was to see those laws so sacred that they wanted to put a fence around them so that they had no chance of ever breaking the Mosaic commandments. So that these laws are to prevent them from breaking the commandments became enshrouded in the laws as well. So there were thousands and thousands of laws rather than just the simple ones that God gave initially to his people. But these Pharisees tended to be sticklers for the law. They tended to be the police, if you like, to make sure everybody towed the line, because to not obey the law meant that you were out of covenant. And for a devout Jew, that was to be out of fellowship with God's people was just something that they couldn't consider. But as well as that, these lay people, these Pharisees, they hated the Greco-Roman influence, the culture of Hellenism, which was predominant in at that time. They were middle-class people, and who could afford not to work for 7 days straight. They could afford to have a day off a week and still provide for their families. So that were the Pharisees. They had particular dress that they got done up in and so on and so forth. The Sadducees were a second group, a religious political sect. So it wasn't that they were just religious, but it was part of their race or their tribe and their passion. And their passion was also part of their politics of the day. So the Sadducees were probably descendant from the tribe of Levi. And if you will understand, in the Old Testament, they were the only tribe not to be granted a parcel of land. All of the other tribes were given a parcel of land, and the reason that the Sadducee or the tribe of Levi didn't get any land was because they were the priests, and they were given the custodianship of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. And so these Sadducees were priestly aristocrats. They were people that didn't have to work because all of the income they got were from the tithes and the offerings that the people brought to worship. They were wealthy people. They lived off the fat of the land. And they were custodians of the temple precincts. They looked after the temple, they did any maintenance work that needed to be done, which wasn't a lot. They were very narrow-minded in terms of what they believed. And for them, the scriptures weren't all of God's revelation. In fact, all of God's revelation to them was bound to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what they called Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That was it. Nothing more. And that was the complete revelation of God. Because of their narrow focus of the scriptures, they could not accept, therefore, the doctrines of the prophets. and the doctrines of the later writings, which included resurrection, judgment, and messianic expectation. So, these were the priests, Sadducees. There were also the Essenes. Now, there's no mention of the Essenes in the New Testament. However, we do know from history that there were many people as part of the Essene community. They were folk who were disgusted with the corruption of the temple, of the sacrifices, of the way in which the Sadducees and the priests went about doing their work. And so they excluded themselves from the city life of Jerusalem, the country life of living in the country surrounding Jerusalem, and they withdrew to a monastic and a reclusive life, looking like a sect, we would probably call them today. And they had a strict code of life, the community code, and for them the scriptures, which they accepted the whole of the canon of the Old Testament, prophets, Torah, prophets and writings, and they saw it as their duty to not just study and interpret the sacred writings, but also to copy them. So they were, they copied the scrolls of the Old Testament. They interpreted the scriptures for their community. They had a code of discipline for their community. They had a war scroll, a copper scroll, which was to set out what they were to do in case of being attacked. They had rites of baptism and various other rites of passage. It would appear, I guess, from our study of the New Testament that John the Baptist probably fitted with this particular religious group of people. That he come from the desert, that he wore a camel's skin coat tied around with a snakeskin belt, and he ate locusts and wild honey. So this is sort of a picture of the monastic, ascetic life of an Essene. Another political group at the time of Jesus is the Zealots. Now, these were really religious fanatics who were probably best described like they were pious cutthroats, prepared to assassinate and kill off any of the people who opposed God's reign. They were zealous for the promises that God had given to Israel through the Old Testament. And They were looking for a time of the coming of Messiah, and especially if they could help Messiah to come, they would do so by political revolution. And it's said that they sparked the Roman War of 66 to 73 in the Christian era. And we know that in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. It's interesting when we look at the disciples that Jesus chose, that there would have been probably a sprinkling of at least the Pharisees, Sadducees and Zealots amongst them. Now, in Matthew, have you any idea what the other name for Matthew is? In Matthew's Gospel, it's not Matthew, but what?
For some reason I'm thinking it starts with an S, but I'm probably wrong.
No, it starts with L, and it's actually connected with
Oh, Levi.
Levi. That's right. Now, what can you tell me about the Levites in the New Testament? Who were they? What particular sect would they be associated with?
I don't know.
The Levites were what? They didn't have a land allocated to them because...
Oh, so there'd be Sadducees.
No, he was from the priestly line,
Yeah.
right? So he had no problem collecting taxes for Rome,
Oh.
right? So he was a collaborator with Rome, probably a Sadducee. But also we have one of the 12 is Simon the Zealot.
Yep.
Woo! Imagining putting those two guys together. See some skin and hair flying, perhaps. So we've got a bit of a picture there of that Jesus didn't just collect all Pharisees being lay people, but he saw the opportunity to gather people from the mainstream and as much broadness as he could in selecting his disciples. Now, as well as this, your homework sheet requires you to look up Samaritan, which I didn't realise when I did this. A Samaritan is another one of the political sects. And it's going to help you to understand a little bit of the history of the people of Israel from the Old Testament. Okay, so we've got a succession of, we'll come with this a little bit later when we look at the history of Israel leading up to Jesus. But if we can just picture for a minute that the northern kingdom of Israel, which involved 10 different tribes, the southern kingdom were 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Right, they were the 2 tribes around Jerusalem, and then there was the northern 10 tribes which sort of had their capital at either Samaria or Bethel. Right. Now, in 721 BC, I mean, when we're talking King David, we're talking about 1000 BC, and then Solomon after that, probably 940 BC. And after Solomon, there was a break between the north and the south. When Solomon died, there was a fight. Rehoboam was the king that was elected, and he didn't take any notice of the elders and upped the taxes, which were pretty heavy at the time, and therefore the northern kingdom said, well, it's too far to come to Jerusalem, we'll form our own kingdom in the north, and Jeroboam became the king of the north.
Yep.
So after Solomon died, there were two kings, and that started two different kingdoms, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. Now, in 722 BC, the northern kingdom was attacked and fell to the Assyrians. And they just killed a lot of people. Didn't take many prisoners at all, and they just demolished Samaria, basically. But they didn't kill everyone, and they took off. There were a lot of people that were living out in the country areas and who were still there, who made their... and they still stayed there. But they didn't have a king to consolidate and unite. And so what happened was they intermarried with the tribes for many years following that. So that's in the area of Samaria, north of Judah and Benjamin. The southern kingdom, however, because it was in the mountains, Jerusalem on Mount Zion, was pretty well fortified, and so the Assyrians couldn't penetrate. But the Babylonians came in three waves, 603, 597 and 587, I think, or thereabouts, and they destroyed the southern kingdom and took captives, they took slaves to Babylon. So that became what was called the exile. Now, when the exiles came back, they rebuilt the wall under Nehemiah, right? And so there was from that time a consolidation of what they called the Jews, because this was the tribe of Judah basically that returned and rebuilt Jerusalem and consolidated the southern kingdom as Israel. And they ignored the northern kingdom because there was no king. But there was no king in the south either, because their king was back in Persia. Persians had overrun the Babylonians and had allowed Nehemiah to return to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and so people returned back. The reason I tell you that is because when we talk about Samaria or the Samaritans, the people of the southern kingdom who saw themselves as pure blood Jews despised the people from the north who had intermarried and not kept their Jewish Israelite blood pure. And so there was a despising of the Jews from the south and the Samaritans of the north. And that's brought home in the melodrama of the Good Samaritan.
Yep.
In Luke chapter 10, where Jesus tells the story of the priest and the Levite, again from the southern kingdom, who are walking past and not caring for this person who's been attacked by robbers on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho. Do you understand the topography and the geography of the place? Jerusalem's up on top of the mountain, 5,000 feet above sea level. Jericho is below sea level, near the entrance of the Jordan to the Dead Sea.
Yep.
And it's not far away as the crow flies. And it's a mountainous road to get down from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's on that road that this guy gets mobbed and robbed and the Samaritan comes along, everybody goes, when they hear the Levite and the priest, they go, "Ray, Ray." When they hear the Samaritan, boo, hiss. This melodrama. But you see, it's the Samaritan who helps the guy who's been attacked and cares for him, puts him on his donkey, wraps up his wounds, provides for his upkeep till he gets better, and then pays the innkeeper for his board when he returns. So there was an overturning of the expectations and of the attitude towards the Samaritans. In the beginning of the book of Acts, you will receive power, Acts 1:8. Jesus says, when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, you'll be witnesses to me in Jerusalem. Where's the next place? In Samaria, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So God's not forgotten about the Samaritans, even though the people of Judah had. Right, so that's a bit of a picture. And also you can find a little bit of information about that in John chapter 4, because in that chapter Jesus meets the Samaritan woman
At the well.
at the well, that's right. And there's a bit of discussion about where we worship. The Samaritans worship on Mount Gerizim, but the Jews worship in Jerusalem. And so there's a comparison there. Even though they worship the same God, it's about the place of worship which has become the issue. Okay. We've spent a lot of time talking about that. Let's have a look at the brief history of the nation of Israel. So, if we start with Abraham and press on to Jesus, we've got a brief, very, very brief here history of what took place, of perhaps names and places and events that took place. Let's have a look. The patriarchs, again, these are mentioned in the first five books of the first six books of the Old Testament. Genesis is the story of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. Exodus is the story of Moses. Leviticus, the priestly story. Numbers, the narratives of Moses in the wilderness, and Joshua and Caleb as his offsiders. And then you have the story of Joshua in the Promised Land in the book of Joshua. Judges is an early story of the struggle of the people of God to overcome evil, but seem to be, there's almost a vicious cycle happening in the book of Judges, where the people of God cry out to God for help, and God raises up a judge who rescues the people, and while ever the judge is alive, he's protecting the people of God. But then after some time, the judge dies and the people of God slip back into their old ways of life. They forget God's laws and they forget about worship, and they worship idols, and they're attacked by their enemies, and so they cry out to God again. And so the cycle continues. That's what happens in the book of Judges right throughout. Then we come to the book of Ruth, which happens in the time of the Judges. And it's really a history narrative of King David's grandparents. And that's put there as a genealogical, but also as a support structure for David, who's the king after God's own heart. And then we have the prophetic narrative books of 1 and 2 Samuel that highlight the ministry of Samuel, but also after Samuel passes away, we have the prophetic role of Nathan. And it covers the beginning of Samuel's ministry in the time of the Judges, leading up to the beginning of the monarchy. The first king was, do you know? First king that brought the tribes together. King Saul, right? And King Saul was the one whom God had chosen to rescue the people from attack. The main threat was the Philistines at that time, and so that enabled Saul was the king who was combating the Philistines. But it was David who actually, while Saul was king, as a shepherd boy, conquered Goliath.
Yep.
You remember that story in 1 Samuel 17? How the giant Goliath of Gath was killed by David. And so that began the rise of David, who then was anointed king in nomination while Saul was king, and how later he became the king of Judah, and then much later again became the king of Israel. So when we look at David's life, he was anointed 3 times. Once as a shepherd boy at his nomination while Saul was king. Secondly, after Saul died, to become the king of Judah. And then in 2 Samuel 5, I think, where he was anointed king of Israel, the whole of the 12 tribes. And then when David died, his son Solomon, there were some attempts by other brothers of Solomon to become king, but Solomon became king after David died, and he ruled with wisdom, and his penmanship, not just some of the Psalms, but also the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon.
And built the temple.
Sorry?
And built the temple.
And built the temple. Yeah, so there were some significant events, and I'm glad you raised that, Robert, because David wanted to build the temple for God. Because up until the time, well, including all the time of David's life, the temple, the Ark of the Covenant was housed in a tent of animal skins. And David wanted to build a bricks and mortar house for the Ark of the Covenant, a place for people to come and worship the one true God. Nathan the prophet came to David when David shared that with him, And Nathan had encouraged David to share what was in his heart, to his desire for God to do. And Nathan came to him the following day and said, look, David, I can't give you your request. You want to build a house for God, that's not going to happen. But instead, God's going to build you a house. 2 Samuel 7 was an important promise for David to hang on to. That promise of a paradox, if you like. You want to build God a house? Sorry, God's going to build you a house. In other words, a dynasty. So that God's blessing would be on David's descendants for all time. And that God made a promise to David that there would be for all time a descendant of his on the throne. But we know that history tells us that in 587 BC, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, that the last king in David's line, Zedekiah, was killed. So what of this promise for eternity that God was going to have a Davidic king on the throne of Israel? And I don't know if you're familiar with the laments of the Old Testament found in the Psalms, but 1/3 of the Psalms are laments where the people of God cry out to God, what have you done, Lord? Where am I? I'm lost. There is a lament of Psalm 89 where the psalmist cries out to God, why have you reneged on your promise, God? Where is the king of David's line that you promised? His throne has been tossed over, his scepter's in the dirt, and you've left us hopeless, helpless, without your anointed one. And that's how the psalm ends. And so that's really, I guess, the cry of God's people. Where is your Messiah? And there was that expectation, a post-exilic expectation that God was going to raise up the person of his choice that would fit the bill for a messianic person. So the Jews returned from Babylon, singing the songs of Zion as they returned under Nehemiah and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem with Ezra, their governor, and Joshua, their high priest. After they had rededicated this second temple, Zerubbabel's temple, wasn't a scratch on the first one that Solomon had built with all of its silver and gold and cedar and glory. But this second temple was amazing. It enabled the people of God to come and to climb and to worship their God every Saturday. Interesting, in the book of Psalms we have 15 songs of ascents. I think it's from 121 to 135. These called songs of ascents, and they're the songs that the people of God sang as they spiraled their way and climbed their way to the temple to worship God. after the exile. And this period of time continued until the rise of Hellenism, brought about by Alexander the Great, who began a military campaign from southern Europe right across to India. Not just military, but culturally. People were anticipating the culture of Hellenism, mostly. There was the Greek language, the philosophies, the mythology, Greek mythology. There was the stories of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, that were being disseminated. And no doubt the troops from Alexander's army were intermarrying into all of these cultures that they were conquering. And this was not just a military campaign, but it was intensifying the Hellenistic brand across the world. The language, classical Greek, was what Alexander spoke, but because classical Greek was the language that was being taught across the then known world, it became the like English for the world.
Yep.
The lingua franca. It was the language to learn. It was the language that enabled trade to happen. But in so doing, it became colloquialised. There were a lot of slang, and the King's English, if you like to say, became very slang. And this slang type of Greek was what was called Koine Greek, or Common Greek. And this Koine Greek was the language of the New Testament. It was in the language of the people. It was in the language that most people could speak or could understand, even if it wasn't their first language. And long after Alexander died, well, immediately after, he never had an heir to take over his throne. And so what happened was his 4 generals took over, and they each took over a parcel of land. But they were never satisfied, and the Seleucids and the Ptolemies fought against one another and tried to gain each other's property and land. And for a period of time, Antiochus IV, whose nickname was Epiphanes, in other words, the revelation of God, he liked to see himself as, was the dictator, if you like, of the region of Palestine. And he was warring with the Ptolemies of Egypt. And so this was a Seleucid empire and so he controlled Palestine. But his was a tyrannical rule, and was forcing people to become Hellenists at the point of a sword. But this was an anathema to the people of Israel. They were modest. the Hellenists were building gymnasiums, big stadiums around the place where all of the athletes performed naked. And this was horror to the Jews. They were modest people. There was also, they built hippodromes, in other words, turf clubs, that they used to race horses and all sorts of things. There were, if you read the opening chapters of Maccabees, First Maccabees chapter 1, you'll discover what a horror it was for the Hellenists to come in and run the show. And in fact, what took place was that there were some renegades, Jewish renegades, who lived out in the country. And when the Syrian Hellenists came, guards bringing their idol, bow down and worship or we'll kill you, everyone in the village had to come out and bow down to this idol or be slaughtered. So the priest of Modane, Mattathias, slaughtered the soldiers, grabbed the soldier's sword and ran him through. And that began what was called the Maccabean Revolt. Lasted 7 or 8 years. And at the end of that, during that period, the Jews regained their independence. And that was for 100 years. So they had this 100 years of independence. During that time, they reinstated the kingship, the monarchy in Israel, and they began to follow the traditions and the Jewish way of life. After that 100 years of freedom and independence, under Pompey, who was a Roman general, came in and took over in Jerusalem. And from then on we have a Roman official in charge of what takes place in Jerusalem. So that was the case when Jesus was born, that the Romans were in control. Even though there was a king still in place, he was only a puppet, King Herod. So if we go to the next slide, what we have there is, again, following our brief history of the nation of Israel, leading up to the period of Jesus and the writing of the Gospels, we have something of the Hebrew heritage that's retained by the people living in Palestine, where there things that they valued greatly were the scriptures, their worship of Yahweh, the law, the priests, and the sacrifices in the temple. So they're some of their heritage that they bring that as part of the gospel teaching of Jesus. And then also as part of the history, we can see also from the historical stuff in the previous slide that it was a post-exilic time where there was no Davidic monarchy. It's what's called the Second Temple period. Now, under Herod the Great, he borrowed or took a lot of the wealth from the temple and sold it to raise money to refurbish the temple, to make a legacy for himself, right? Which didn't go down too well, which actually probably turned the Essenes away from their worship of God in the temple to leave and retreat into the wilderness. There were unsettled times. With the Roman conquest and the post-exilic era. But there was also Hellenistic influence over Palestine. That not only was the mother tongue Aramaic and their Bible language of Hebrew, but there was also a common language that was from the traders that were coming in and travelling, because the trade route was still through Palestine. Even it was from Assyria way to the east, they'd travel north and then down through Palestine to Egypt. They wouldn't come across the desert, they'd come through the fertile places. Also, the Hellenistic period brought about what's called the diaspora. Now, do you know what diaspora means? It's referred to in the book of James. I don't know if you've got your Bibles there. Have a look in James. We can find a little bit of what it means. The beginning of James chapter 1 verse 1. You got it? Anybody got it there? You got it, Mike? You can read it for us?
Rob to do everything.
Yeah.
James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations.
Okay, so this was what was the case.
Greetings.
It was not safe sometimes for God's people to stay in Jerusalem. Now, this was the case when Antiochus Epiphanes was the dictator. If you were a true follower of God, you could not stay in Jerusalem. Otherwise, your head would be chopped off or be run through, because Jerusalem was controlled by the Hellenists. They had what was called the Acra, and it was a fort, and the fort was protected from without, which was the controlling centre of Jerusalem, and it was run by the Hellenists, or the people who were Greeks, were persuaded to follow Antiochus and his mob. And so if you were a true follower of God, you shot through, and you took with you your true faith in Judaism. And because of that, communities of Jews flourished everywhere, not just in Judah, where that was home, where the temple was. And this was what was called the diaspora, the dispersion, the scattered tribes of God's people.
Which then links in well with how Paul does his missionary trips and
That's right.
engages with people in all the different cities of the Mediterranean.
Certainly. And as a result, the diaspora Judaism became a reality. And there were two aspects of that. First of all, in the particular place, if you had 10 or more devout followers of God, Judaism, then you would build, or then you will have your synagogue. Because with 10 families, all tithing, you can support a priest. someone from the tribe of Levi, mostly. And so the synagogue was birthed. And we find synagogues in Capernaum, right throughout Palestine, but scattered abroad. When Paul went on his missionary journeys, there were synagogues everywhere. In fact, where Paul went preaching, he wasn't just in open places. He did a synagogue crawl. And the people that heard and responded to the message weren't necessarily Jews, but were God-fearers, the phobumenoi, as we find in our Greek New Testament.
What's the word for it?
The phobumenoi, the God-fearers. So these God-fearers were the ones who responded mostly to the message of Paul, and they were probably Gentiles by birth who embraced the teachings of Judaism. Some of them would have become proselytes, in other words, were circumcised and baptised into the Jewish faith to become Jews. Others were not all that convinced, but nevertheless were responsive to Paul's teaching. Further to that, there were a lot of people growing up in the diaspora who could not speak Aramaic or Hebrew, and therefore could not read their Bibles. And so it behoved the people of God in Alexandria, which was the largest centre of Judaism at the time in northern Africa, to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Koine Greek. And this they did in the 2nd century BC, and the resultant was what's referred to as the LXX, the abbreviation of the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Now, I didn't bring my Septuagint with me, even though I've got a copy of it. It's a very interesting document because it's not in the same order as our Old Testament. It's in a completely different order. In fact, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is not in the order of our canon. The last book in the Hebrew canon is not Malachi, it's 2nd Chronicles.
Really? I guess that makes sense.
Because that's the latest of the books of the Old Testament in terms chronological written.
Does it include the intertestamental, the Deuterocanonical books?
No, the Hebrew canon doesn't. No.
Yeah, okay.
So this is the Hellenistic side of things. Then also we've got the Roman, if we can understand some of the Roman culture happening. This is only in the last 60 odd years or so, when Jesus is born, that the Roman influence has come into Palestine. And what's called the Pax Romana, you heard of that? It's the peace of Rome. But it's not Christian peace. I mean, peace of Rome is the absence of war. In other words, Rome is such a mighty military force, no one dare fight with us, right? Therefore, there is peace. So, Pax Romana is the extinction of war because of the might of Rome. Also, what we know about Rome is that they built a lot of roads. And their road making was incredible. They had fantastic technology that put the huge boulders at the bottom of the foundations of the road, smaller boulders on top, and then smaller rocks to cover that, pounded down, and then road base over the top, covered with pavers. solid construction. So that even today, we're talking thousands of years, 2,000 years or more, after Roman rule, the roads are still there today. Incredible thing that these roads were so straight, they used to build a fire at one end and they used to work towards the fire. The roads were straight, they were long, and the first time in history an army regiment can get from one place to another very quickly using chariots or foot soldiers. They could get to where they got to go very quickly. Citizenry was the ace. To be a citizen of Rome was a free ticket, a free passport to go anywhere. If you didn't have Roman citizenship, you were second class. There were, because of Roman authority, capital offences. Basically 3 capital offences. And they were stealing, rioting, treason. Murder wasn't one of them. If you stole anything that didn't belong to you, crucifixion. Rioting, crucifixion. And that's why the zealots were hunted under Roman law. They were the ones who incited riots. And one time, on one particular occasion, there were 500 crosses where the Romans crucified 500 people for rioting. And in Palestine, what we had to reinforce or to enforce the Roman way of life was a procurator, the Roman official. Now at Jesus, the way for the Jews to kill a lawbreaker was how? No, a Jew we're talking. How were Jews? That's right, they used to throw rocks. Stoning. That's it. But Jesus wasn't stoned to death. He was brought before Pilate, who was the Roman official. Now, other people were stoned, even Stephen, after Jesus was crucified and rose. It seemed to me, though, that because of the publicity of who Jesus was and what he did, that it wasn't something that could have been done on the spur of the moment, but because of the prominence of who Jesus was and what he was, his ministry, it had ramifications to the Roman official in Jerusalem. Pontius Pilate was that official. Okay, well, let's press on. We might have a 10-minute break and come back together, and then we can do some exercises, which covers your homework. Sounds good. Okay. On page 7 of your outline is what we need to do for our homework that's due in a fortnight. There's four pieces of work. We're going to have a look at the first of those. You'll find it on page 19. Also, you'll need to refer to the resource that's in your outline. No, sorry, the resource number. Maybe it is in your outline. There's a. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. This is your map that you've got, but the also is the resource number 1, which is the map that's from have I got it there? Resources, is that it? Okay, you might have to look in the back of your you have to get online to ACD online to find the maps that we're referring to here. So there's 2 different sections. If you have a look at the map, you'll see there are circles and there are squares.
Yep.
Now the circles represent locations and the squares represent cities or towns. And so they're all listed there. The circles, if we can see here on the board, I didn't bring my little marker, but if we can see here on the board, this area here.
There's a bunch of markers there if you want to use them, Kevin.
Yeah, I don't want to sort of. Oh, okay, I could probably do that. Whiteboard marker on there. The whiteboard marker. So this area here is referred to as the Decapolis. That's A. Galilee is here. Idumea is down here. Judea is here. Nabatea is down here. Perea is over there. Phoenicia, the Phoenicians were great sailors, and so they're on the coast. Samaria is in this middle region here. Syria, actually that should be down here in this area here is I, and the region of the 4 areas, Gaulonitis, Auronitis, Batavia and Trachonitis are over in this area here. Okay, if we're looking at other places on the map, we've got Bethany is here. Bethlehem is south. Bethsaida is up there on Galilee. Caesarea Philippi is the place where Peter confessed that Jesus is the Christ. Up here. Caesarea Maritima is on the coast over here. Cana in Galilee is across from the Sea of Galilee. 6. Capernaum is right by the sea. Damascus is up in Syria. Where's Emmaus is northeast of Jerusalem. Sorry, northwest of Jerusalem. Gadara now in Mark 5, Jesus encountered the Gadarene demoniac. He was probably from Gadara, but he was probably right on the edge of the shore of Galilee over here somewhere. Okay, where we get up to Gesara is down here. Jamnia is over here near the coast. Jericho, when we were talking earlier, I mentioned how Jericho was near the entrance to the Dead Sea. Not far from the Jordan River and probably below sea level. Jerusalem is there on Mount Zion. Joppa is here on the coast. Lydda, again, is just a little bit inland. Machaerus is down here on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. And on the western side, down near the south, is Masada. It was a, what do we call it? It was a mountain with the top levelled off where there was a fort, and it was the last place where the Jews went before the Romans came and killed them. Came to the top and found they were all that committed suicide. This was just after the fall of Jerusalem. And the Romans came to destroy all of the Jewish people. Number 19, Nazareth is up here in Galilee. This little place here. 20, Ptolemais, here on the coast. Samaria, as you'd expect, is in the centre of the province of Samaria. Scythopolis is in this little tract here, part of Decapolis or Decapolis, 10 cities. 23, Sepphoris is over here. Between Nazareth and Ptolemais. Sidon is up north. Tiberias is on the lake, and Tyre is over there in Phoenicia. So there you go, you've done some of your homework. You'll find all of those places on the map. We got any, just before we do get on to that one, let's have a look at some of the other homework, and that is was there any other stuff?
Part 2, social and religious groups.
Now, have you got a copy of these homework sheets?
I've got them online.
You've got them online? Okay, that's good.
Where did you get them from?
They're just
On the AEC.
you can take the if you can.
That's all right. I was just making sure they were online. Which
Yeah.
part of ACD online were they had done?
There you go. Yeah, so they're available on. They're in the outline, pages 19 through to 22.
That's right. We'll find it later.
Okay, so we covered the 5 different political religious sects in the time of Jesus: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Samaritans. So you'll need to write about 1 or 2 sentences, a couple of sentences on each of those. Then there's also you've got a match up. This is on page 21 of the outline.
Yep.
You've got to match up the word with the sentence. So what do you reckon? Temple relates to what? Have you got that on page 21?
Yep. A place of worship and learning in towns, the Jewish communities outside Palestine. Elders played an important role. Worship held on the Sabbath and festival days and continued to the places of worship after destruction.
I think there's a better one than that for temple. Because that is the one that's not in Jerusalem. That was the one that's in towns and Jewish communities. outside Palestine. So that the temple's only in Jerusalem, isn't it?
Oh, so it'd be located in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
place where sacrifice took place, worship. led
That's
by
the
priests.
one. Yep, you found that? It's opposite Feast of Tabernacles booths.
Yep.
You got that? So draw a line between temple and that one. So what did you just identify, Robert? Which one are the ones on the left? The places of worship and learning in towns and Jewish communities outside Palestine. What's the word?
Be synagogue?
Sorry?
Would it be synagogue?
That's the one. Yep, you've got it. So synagogue is the second last one on the right hand side. Places of worship and learning in towns and Jewish communities outside Palestine. So what's the Sabbath? That's the third one down. Sabbath is what?
Day of fasting, prayer and repentance.
Yeah. Although that could be, is that one of the feasts, or is that Day of Atonement?
That's what I was wondering too. I had the other one for Sabbath, family and synagogue-based religious celebration held from sunset Friday, because it said day of rest specifically.
That's the Sabbath. That's right. Family and synagogue-based religious celebration held from sunset Friday, day of rest. That's what Sabbath is.
Yeah.
Righto, what's the Passover? If you like, we can leave that and come back.
Yep.
What would you say? Let's go down to the bottom one. The Sanhedrin. Have you ever heard of that? What do they do?
I've heard of it. I'm not quite sure what it.
Now, it says that Nicodemus was one of the Sanhedrin.
So it's going to be a group thing.
Yeah,
Not
it's
an
a group
individual
thing. But what's the one on the right hand side that connects with Sanhedrin? If it's a group of people,
Yeah.
there's only one that refers to a group of people there that I can see.
Chief judge.
Must be the chief judicial and legislative body.
That's the one.
Judaism.
Yeah, right at the very top. So the Sanhedrin is the chief judicial and legislative body in Judaism. Now, have you heard of the Holy of Holies?
Yep.
You've got it, inner sanctuary of the Jerusalem temple. The high priest.
Most senior priest associated with the temple.
That's the one. The Day of Atonement.
Sounds very grim. day of fasting, prayer, and repentance.
That's what it is.
Important, but it does sound a bit grim.
Yom Kippur. It was the only day when the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies.
With rope and bells and the rest of that.
Yep. Now, we've got 3 left. Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. And if we look at the ones on the right-hand side, the third one down, feast commemorating the wilderness wanderings.
Yep.
What do you think that was out of the feasts? The feast wandering in the wilderness where they had no permanent dwelling.
I'll freely admit I took some educated guesses here with the feasts. But I was guessing that was the Feast of Tabernacles.
That's correct. Where they built a tabernacle or a tent. Right,
That was
so
the reasoning. Yep.
that was the wandering in the wilderness one. Okay, now the feast, the next feast we're looking at is celebrated 50 days after Passover to commemorate the grain harvest. So harvest Thanksgiving,
Yep.
50 or 7 weeks after Pentecost. After Passover, sorry, I let the cat out of the bag.
So the Feast of
is the
Pentecost.
Pentecost, that's right, Feast of Weeks.
That was my other educated guess from the Penty.
And what was the other one? Passover's the only one left, isn't it?
Yeah.
The annual spring festival linked with the remembrance of the escape from Egypt. Remember when they put the blood on the lintels and the doorposts and the angel of death passed over? That's the festival of the Passover. There we go. That was easy, wasn't it? And the final one, if you can remember from my my talk that I've done on the history of leading up from Abraham to Jesus, what year did Rome occupy Palestine? General Pompey marched into Jerusalem in 63 BC, the end of the 100 years of independence. What's the Roman ruler called?
The overall ruler?
Yeah.
The emperor?
The emperor or
Caesar.
Caesar. Correct. Caesar. Caesar is just another name for Kaiser or king. Jesus was born during the reign of which emperor? Let's have a look in our Bibles to Luke chapter 2. So I'm not going to give you all the lay it out all for you on a platter. So you've got to do a little bit of work. Luke chapter 2. Verse 1.
Yep. Augustus.
Caesar Augustus, well done.
What was Tiberius? What's that in reference to?
Sorry?
When's the Emperor Tiberius in reference
Oh,
to? Is that the
you're
persecution?
preempting the next question.
Sorry.
You're right. Who was the Roman governor at the time of Jesus' crucifixion?
Caesar Tiberius.
Tiberius.
Sorry.
All right.
I thought Tiberius was a different Roman emperor. He was governor. Okay.
No, he was the Roman with Caesar.
And wait, all right, I read the next question
Yeah.
this time. But, and
That's
then
all right.
Pontius Pilate was the council?
No, he was
Consul?
the procurator. Procurator.
Procurator.
He was like the,
Like mayor, sort of.
yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
The Roman governor. Yeah, Pilate wasn't the governor. He was,
No, he was just a.
Whatever, regional official or
Something.
well, Tiberius Caesar
Yes,
was
that's
the
true.
overall. Pilate was the, I suppose he was in charge of Palestine,
So he'd be the head of the provincial government.
provincial governor. Yeah, I suppose might be Pilate that goes in there, because he was answerable only to Caesar. So we can put Pontius Pilate there. As the Roman governor. Okay. And what year was the Jewish temple destroyed by the Romans? When did the Romans come and destroy Jerusalem?
Oh, no, it's-
Well, if you can't find it, it was 70 AD. 70 in the Christian era. Okay, now, in the document that I wrote, which is one of the resources, resource number 3, it's called Aspects of Jewish Religious Practice. I've got a little bit of extra detail about the feasts and fasts of ancient Israel. Okay? Jewish New Year, the Day of Atonement, Tabernacles or booths. There's also a few that are not in the Old Testament, like Hanukkah. There is also Purim, Passover and Pentecost. So they are the major festivals of Israel. There's 7 of those, but I've got a little bit of detail in my, which was the 3rd resource on the list there. Okay, just to finish off our time together today, we've been talking about the context of Jesus and putting the Gospels in context of the New Testament. Why is that so important to understand the life and ministry of Jesus? That's the question. And I've got 4 points. First is that it creates better understanding for the readers of the Gospel. If we've got an understanding of the background to the New Testament, we can better appreciate the dynamics of what's happening when we read the Gospel story. We can better understand the geography of the place. Okay.
No, sorry.
We can better understand the geography of the place, right? So if we understand we understand what the context is. We're better able to appreciate the impact that Jesus had on his own people if we understand what was happening in the lives of the people of God at that time. And we are challenged by the gospel as it speaks into our context and lives 2,000 years later. Because if we're understanding what happened then, we can then make implications for us now. And one of the foundational truths of biblical exegesis is that the gospel cannot mean today what it never meant back then. So if we're understanding what it meant for the first century believers, then we've got a better chance of understanding what it means for us. That's why it's important for us to understand what the things are that we've been talking about today. Okay? Got any questions? Anything that you want to go over briefly before we finish up today? Pretty well done. Well, look forward to seeing you in a fortnight, and we'll make a close to there.
Great.
Good.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, listeners and students.
Yeah, thank you to all.